What is the Rosa Institute?
Good question. We help couples overcome infertility and recurrent miscarriage when other treatments have failed. I think that's, in the essence of what it is that we do.
Mhm.
And we educate. We really help people really question the reasons as to why things haven't actually gone to plan. What's interesting about that question is that, often it might seem obvious that when it comes to reproduction, having a baby being the outcome, normal means having sex, get pregnant, having a baby, right? But when it comes to infertility, fascinatingly, it's not usually how people think. It's people almost kind of think like they will go to their doctor, they will have a consultation after a year of not being able to get pregnant, and their doctor will come back to them with typically, well, we've done some tests, everything looks normal, just keep trying. And I'm like, let's pause on that normal answer, on that normal word, because there's usually something that's not quite going to plan when we have to go to the doctor and have this conversation. So that's
Hmm.
essentially what we do, is figure out how do we transform that piece.
Yeah. You mentioned doctors telling people everything is normal. Um, I personally, I would like to have a family one day, but I am single right now. But speaking of doctors calling things normal, I have actually, this is a little bit different than fertility, but I've had like struggles with migraines and like a really very fast metabolism. Like I'm never not hungry. And since I was a kid, I had like my brain waves tested and blood taken. And then when I got older, they even like took my blood and put it in that machine that like spins it around. And then they like do tests. And every time they tell me I'm completely normal. So like, what's up with that? How can people figure out like doctor tells you it's normal, but clearly you're not feeling normal. So what do we
Mm.
do with that?
It's such a great. I think that is such a segue for such a great conversation, because there's a lot of different things that are classified as normal, that there are variations on the thing, right? So there's different people, and I think that one of the ways that I would describe normal in that context would be something like this: a problem is only a problem if it's a problem for you.
Hmm.
Okay. Everything outside of that is normal. So, some people think that they love to identify as a plant. If it's not a problem for them, well, let them identify as a plant, right? But the
Hmm.
point is that in society, we often have like variations, and there's certainly lots of different room to establish normal, quote unquote. Reference ranges when it comes to blood tests is a really great example of that, because you will have, you will go to do a blood test, and when you are in that lab will average out and have a confidence interval on what is typically seen. Right. So normal might be somewhere in the middle, but what's typically seen, there's a standard deviation on both sides. And so what ends up happening is that, let's say we see 1,000 people. And for 1,000 people, this kind of mid range over here is what we see the most. And we see a variation on both sides of that, but typically it's not considered abnormal until it's outside of that reference range, in that kind of outlier range. But the
Hmm.
problem with that is that even in the normal, typically seen, quote unquote, reference, like average of what most people fall under,
Hmm.
there is a huge amount of variation on the symptoms that somebody might experience, even being within that usually seen range, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what you're describing is exactly that. It's like, you will go, you have blood tests. Also think about and consider this: most people who go to have a blood test for a reason. They don't, like, nobody wakes up one morning and go, "Oh, I think it would be so fun today to go and have my blood taken," and just sit through that whole experience. I went to go and have a 2-hour glucose tolerance test because
Hmm.
of prevention. I just wanted to kind of see where's my body at, long-term health, all of those things. But like, I wouldn't consider it anywhere close to the idea of fun to go and sit for 30 minutes to be able to find the time for my appointment first, to then have my first blood collection taken, to take this 75 grams of disgusting drink that I can't even begin to describe how
Mm-hmm.
sweet that thing is, and then not be able to actually take any water after that because you don't want to dilute your blood. And then 5 times in a period of 2 hours, 2 hours sitting in this lab, right, have to be stabbed on the same arm to draw blood. That is not anybody's idea of fun,
Mm-mm.
right? And typically, what happens is with a 2 hour glucose tolerance test, you really only go and have that done if you have a very good reason to believe that you already have elevated symptoms and you already have problems in terms of your glycemic ability to actually process carbohydrates, and you probably are pre-diabetic or diabetic. Like, that's when you go and have that test.
Mm-hmm.
I, outlier, right? On the other side of like not anywhere near the idea of having a problem, not objectively or subjectively, but wanting to really being curious about my health, going, okay, I'm going to go and have this test. Now, what does that do? If we had enough people that had this kind of crazy mindset that I have of prevention, you'd have a whole lot of healthier individuals going to have this particular blood test, which would really refine that confidence interval of what actually is normally seen.
Mm-hmm.
But because that is not the case, and the people who actually go and have this blood test typically are not in the normal range, anywhere kind of ideal at the very least, you end up having a whole lot of people who have a degree of disease that's already progressed from what is actually ideally seen.
Mm-hmm.
And every single blood test that is out there typically follows the same parameter or the same rule, because what happens is that the people who are questioned to potentially have an elevation or a kind of, outside of the range, normal range kind of result, is going to be going for that test already questioning or being questioned by the doctor that there is something not quite right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is essentially what happens. So when you go in and get a result from a doctor that says, oh, yeah, everything is normal, but you're having symptoms, we have to question so much more than the taking it on face value that because of a reference range, this is actually normal. I'll give a very quick example of thyroid function, for example, right? Thyroid function test, the TSH, which is a thyroid stimulating hormone, the range is anywhere between 0.5 to 5. Now, what's ideal for fertility is anything under 2.5. But ultimately, and anything above 2.5 increases the risk of miscarriage or infertility. But when you go to your doctor, you might have a 3.5, a 4, or even 4.5, and you've had a history of miscarriage, but you're not going to be treated typically because the doctor will look at it and go, yes, it's within the range, everything is normal, just keep trying.
Mm-hmm.
And so we end up with recurrent miscarriages, for example. So, long way to describe the challenge that you're experiencing there, having symptoms and being considered like everything is normal, because ultimately it requires a different lens to really dig deeper into what are the biochemical pathways that are not quite working as optimally as they need to be to
Mm-hmm.
have a different response within your own organism, within your own body. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for answering that with so much detail.
That's all right.
Um, so I know I veered into like my personal thing, which was like slightly different than fertility, but can you share some lesser known factors that can significantly impact fertility in both men and women and how couples can address those issues?
That's a really great question. And I think that, it's, let me give you this example. Sometimes, couples will come to me, they've tried for years. In fact, we did a study through my master's in public health at Harvard that demonstrated that the majority of the patients that came to us, they had been infertile for on average 4 years. And, when you think about it, like when most couples in the general population want to start to try to have a baby, most people actually conceive without trying.
Mhm.
So what happens is, this is why we hear so many stories of people saying things like, I wasn't trying. I didn't really want to get pregnant, and it just, oops, just happened. It was the drunken one night stand kind of situation that just, oops, this is what happened.
Yep.
That's what is normal in the general population, right? So the
Yeah.
majority of people, they won't even be trying. They just kind of, like most people, even that people that I talk to, when they've experienced secondary infertility, they're like, the first time we weren't even trying. We were just kind of like not using protection, and all of a sudden we just got pregnant. This time we're not having that experience. Now, the reason that happens is because throughout the entire population, typically you need 3 conception attempts to get pregnant. And this is the normal kind of range, right? It's literally get sex, get pregnant, have a baby, done. We're no longer having this conversation. When we're still having this conversation after 3 attempts, then we need to start asking these questions of like, okay, what could be going on here? What else is not quite right? And when it passes the 12-month mark, then we know that we definitely have some kind of problem,
Mhm.
because after 12 attempts, it's 4 times more than what is typically expected for couples
Mhm.
actually trying to conceive. So then we really have to question, all right, what's going on, and what do we need to do?
Mhm.
What happens in that regard is that the exposome, which is all of the things that we are surrounded by, whether it's in our day-to-day environment, whether it's in our, like, the neurochemicals that we kind of are swimming in within our body, what the diet that we have, the lifestyle that we have, the other exposures that we might have, toxins, etc. We have
Yeah.
so many of those different things that are present in our day to day and that are present in our lives that we often don't recognize. And this is really the biggest challenge, that comes with identifying the reason or reasons that a couple may be experiencing infertility, because there are so many different things that could be playing a role, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the explanation, and I guess this is something that is going to help you understand what I'm getting to here. Let's say, for example, a man goes and has a semen analysis, right? And he sees that, okay, the motility, or the way that the sperm swim, or the shape of the sperm morphology is abnormal. Let's say that those parameters are not quite where they need to be. You can actually have 10 men, literally do a lineup, 10 men with low motility, and you can absolutely have 10 different reasons as to why that's happening.
Mm.
Okay. So it's almost like, the way that I like to describe this is this experience and this understanding that sometimes we forget. We've all heard of people who have never smoked a day in their life and died of lung cancer. And we've heard of people who basically are chain smokers who never developed cancer
Yeah.
whatsoever. Right. So you kind of question, you kind of go, well, yeah, that's actually how does that happen? Well, the way that that happens is because of epigenetics, because the differential impact of an exposure in our day to day, i.e., the fertility exposome, the things that are in our surrounding environments that impact us, but our bodies respond to them in a different way.
Mhm.
Okay, so for some people, they have the predisposition of whatever that exposure was, let's say cigarette smoking, causing cancer. For another person, that same cigarette smoke will cause infertility. For another, it might cause heart disease, and so on and so forth. So when we ask the question of what are the things that, are causing the lesser known things, there are so many lesser known things. In fact, I would say that they are all lesser known,
Yeah.
because if they were so clear, it would be much easier for us to be able to just have a checklist that says, okay, all of these things, don't do them, or implement the opposite of those things. But it's not as easy as that. And the reason that it's not as easy is because of this phenomenon, so to speak, of not quite having a very clear direct relationship between an exposure and an outcome.
Mhm.
And that's
Yeah.
essentially what can sometimes really trick us, or almost trip us up, when it comes to not understanding um, what are all of the things that could be impacting us. Now, of course, there are things that we already know, and I'm happy to talk about some of the things that, and I will do that next, some of the things that actually will make a difference, so that people need to be aware about. But it's all that to say that just because your sister, your uncle, your mother, your grandmother smoked, did drugs, drank alcohol, and had quote unquote healthy babies, does not mean that the same applies to you, especially if you are having difficulty achieving the same outcome. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. You covered a lot of ground there, and I'm like, oh man, I have so many questions bubbling up as you go along. One of which is you mentioned the what I like to call the oops babies. Um,
Oh, yes.
I tell people that I was an oops baby, and I like to say that
So was I.
all the cool kids were oops babies. But I'll tell a little bit more about myself. I was actually adopted from birth, and my biological mother, I don't know a lot of the details, but I believe that she was like around 40 years old and did not think that she could have another baby. And then that's how I became the magical oops. um, and I also found it really interesting how you said like 10 men could line up and it could be 10 different reasons why it's not working. Just goes to show like how individual humans are. Um, but I'm kind of like going in a couple different directions here. But one thing that came up is you said lots of times people aren't even trying when they have their baby. And so it made me wonder, when they are trying, I wonder if it's like the mental stress that's making it harder. And then when the accident happens, it's because they weren't even thinking about it. And I wonder if there's some kind of mental connection and stress affecting it. Is there anything there?
Yeah, look, I think that's such a good question. And there are two schools of thought, and there are two areas that I would say we need to consider when it comes to this, right? The first is that there are people all the time and have throughout history gotten pregnant in war zones and delivered healthy babies in those conditions,
Hmm.
right? So we again need to go to the reverse of, okay, yes, that could be something that is playing a role here. But we also need to take into consideration that if infertility or recurrent miscarriage was singularly driven, then it would be really simple, right? It would be just like, okay, let's just go on a holiday. And every person who was ever trying to get pregnant and goes on a holiday gets pregnant and has a baby. Doesn't quite happen that way, right?
Right.
Because again, there is that differential impact of what happens to this particular person. Now, it's not to say that stress and hypothalamic, kind of imbalances, which is the way in which the brain signals the thyroid and the ovaries to have that whole hormonal cascade that will really benefit a regular cycle for women, and of course hormone sperm production for men. That's all going to be very, very important, but it's not on its own something that we can like pin all of our hopes on, right?
Mm.
And I think that this is really important for a lot of women in particular, and couples experiencing infertility, because I often get the question from those couples that goes something like this: is me being stressed about not getting pregnant creating the problem of me not getting pregnant? And I say, even if it were the case, being stressed about stressing isn't going to get you pregnant. Right. And so we almost have to disconnect from that being a variable, of course, addressing it in every possible way that we can. But if we think about it, our bodies didn't evolve very much from what it was like 10,000 years ago, where really it was about running away from the saber-toothed tiger, right? It was like literally all of the point of stress was an acute stress where you really had to like focus on the most important and essential organs for warding off immediate danger. So there was nothing else that was important other than brain to kind of figure out a strategy to run away, your muscles, your lungs, your heart, like everything else. For example, digestion. Well, why would you want to digest your food when you're about to become food? Right? Why would the little bug inside you really is not going to make any difference in this very moment, because there is a much bigger beast behind you that wants to end you or
Mhm.
make it it's dinner, right? And of course, then reproduction. Why would we even want to consider reproducing when, of course, we're about to become food? So shut all of those systems down. We don't have any need for them, and we'll focus on that again when we come to it. And that's a really adaptive response, physiologically speaking, for the body to have under acute conditions of stress. The issue is when stress becomes maladaptive and it starts to become chronic, and or is already chronic and is going on for long periods of time without respite. Right? Then the body does not have the opportunity to go back to opening up those functions and systems once more to be able to do what it is that it needs to do naturally. And so then imbalances in all of those hypothalamic disorders start to occur. You know, we can have irregular cycles, we can have like reproduction be impaired from that perspective. So as much as, and I always recommend to my patients, I say, look, do everything possible to, as much as possible, decrease your baseline of acute response in your day to day, right? And be as even as you possibly can in terms of your mood, in terms of your emotions. And, you know, I love meditation, love exercise as part of this process. But it's again not going to be something that we are only going to address that and all of a sudden we're going to miraculously have an outcome, because there may be other factors that are getting in the way that we need to address in order to be able to get a different outcome. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. Yeah. What are some of the methods that you use to discover what these other factors are?
Diagnostic testing, right? So, except that instead of just going by reference ranges, because that's where a lot of times, so in healthcare systems around the world, and we treat patients literally in every continent other than Antarctica. So we have visibility to healthcare systems everywhere. UK, US, Australia are the places where we see most of our patients, but literally we have patients in every continent, which basically helps us to be able to really understand what are the differences and variations in how people are treated across the world. What's fascinating is that it's very similar, right, in most places. And what happens, and the reason as to why it's similar, is because every healthcare system across the globe wants to cut costs.
Mm.
Every healthcare system across the globe is overburdened by the demands caused by disease and an aging population and lots of, you know, kind of modern Western diseases that typically these days we used to die from infections and trauma, right? That was really the reasons as to why 50, 100 years ago we used to die. These days we no longer are dying from infections and trauma like we used to. We're dying from non-communicable diseases. We're dying from diabetes. We're dying from cancer. We're dying from cardiovascular disease. Those are
Mhm.
the kind of biggest things. And those diseases, because they are chronic and they occur over a very long period of time, it puts additional burden, especially as people start to decrease in health quality, and the ability to self sustain. They rely and need more and more input from the healthcare system, which
Mhm.
places an incredible amount of burden on the system. It certainly drains its resources in a great way. And that is a problem for infertility, because when you think about it, since the majority of the population conceives without trying, people are typically not, in terms of governments and healthcare, you know, kind of systems, are not really that concerned with the fact that there are people who are healthy and typically, quote unquote, healthy, and are trying to get pregnant and having difficulty. Because also, that is a minority of the population, even though, I mean, the numbers are huge. If you think about it, 1 in 6 couples experiences infertility. So it's it's staggering if you think about it. There's, you know, 60, 48 to different statistics from different places, but around 60 million people around the world suffer from infertility. But all the resources that typically could go towards proper diagnoses and understanding more about what's going on ends up going and being reverted back to these other conditions that are more pressing, are more acute, and are more likely to kill people quicker.
Yeah, yeah.
You see? But also, one of something that's really interesting, and I just want to kind of point out here and highlight, is that often the reasons as to why infertility is occurring, there are almost these little signaling red flags very, very early on for these communicable diseases, non-communicable diseases, sorry, that are going on. So basically, there was a study that was done that showed that people who had an infertility diagnosis and just went to IVF to resolve it, for example, had a greater all-cause more death from all-cause mortality uh, in because of that diagnosis, right? So basically,
Mhm.
what did that mean? It meant that if you're diagnosed with infertility and you don't address the reasons as to why that's happening, you're much more likely to die from all other causes of death, earlier than you
Wow.
would had you not had that infertility diagnosis. So it's almost like infertility in this case can be looked at as a proxy for long-term health, right? But
Yeah.
unfortunately, it's not addressed in the majority of healthcare systems. In fact, in no healthcare system, this is kind of like almost in the fringe. What we do would be considered in the fringe of the healthcare system because we do address infertility as a marker for other health conditions that we do need to address, because we also know that these symptoms that are preceding the diagnosis of infertility that will cause other disease in the future are happening because of something that, if unaddressed, will eventually develop into these other diseases. And so I think that there's so much more that could be done, but unfortunately, the resources are just not there focused with that lens to really not only support those couples, but prevent disease in the long term.
Yeah, and I think that we have a like in the West, I think we tend to in healthcare not look at things like as a whole. And so I find that very interesting. I never thought about looking at an infertility diagnosis as a signpost for something greater, something more,
Yeah,
something that needs to be addressed more deeply.
yeah,
That's very interesting. I'm curious. So, a lot of people that listen to the show know this. I went to the Brazilian Amazon last year and spent some time with the indigenous tribe there. And you don't see a lot of diabetes and cancer and those kind of things with people living like in the jungle, and people that are kind of not living in the West, if you will.
yeah.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts or opinions on why in the West is like cancer and diabetes and all these things suddenly so prevalent when probably, I don't know, 100 years ago, like you said, it was like you're going to die from like infection or trauma. And now we have all these weird new diseases coming, and you really don't see that, for example, in the jungle. So like,
Yeah.
do you
Yeah.
have any thoughts on like what's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I want to say that we have lots of commonalities, from being oops babies to, to the Amazon. I was there as well last year. I was actually born and raised in Brazil. So
Oh,
it's
cool.
funny that you mentioned, Brazil. But and the reason is, there are certainly, I mean, in terms of the Brazilian population in general, there is a huge impact. The westernization of cultures and diets has taken over Brazil in the same way that it has many other kind of more traditional cultures. If you have a look as well, Mexico is the same thing. More and more people are becoming sick from cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancers, and it's happening with a huge amount of association that from diet.
Yeah.
If you have a look at the fact that in the jungle, it's going to be more difficult. Again, not impossible, because in these days, like I said, I was there last year, and you find Coca-Cola to buy pretty much everywhere, right?
Mhm.
Around like at the entry points of the forest and all of those things. But if you actually go more into the jungle, obviously the access to these types of ultra processed and processed foods is going to be more difficult. The
Hmm.
problem that happens in those indigenous cultures as well is that sometimes because they are more remote, they are getting sicker as well. And this happens with the Aborigines in Australia too, right? And you can probably hear I have an Australian accent. After I was kind of moved from Brazil when I was about 13, and my family went to Australia where we immigrated, and I've kind of been living for most of my life. So I've got like that visibility of those different cultures. And what's interesting to see these days is that when it comes to indigenous cultures, the more access they have to Western civilization and Western practices, the sicker they become faster. So this is
Yeah.
happening with the Brazilian Indians. This is happening with the Australian Aborigines. This is happening, in other indigenous cultures in the US. So basically, the reason really is because of our exposures. If we think about it, what is happening in our day to day is that more and more we're having processed foods, packaged foods, and gosh, I hate to say it, but I think Coca-Cola hasn't done any great things for the world on many levels, because the amount of pollution, the amount of food, I can't even call some of these things food, right? If you think about it,
Hmm.
like I have one mentor that talks it about carnival, what is it, food experiments, something, like fun carnival, fun fair, food experiments, something like that. And really that's what is going on in our day to day. We're more and more impacted by convenience. We are, as a huge rule, more sedentary than ever. We're sitting and we're doing less in terms of our physical movement and utilizing the way that our body was actually meant to be utilized. And
Hmm.
so a lot of these different things will be happening as a result of our newfound behaviors that, I don't think we should be modeling everything that happens in the Western world. But unfortunately, so many cultures, traditional cultures, are beginning to do that and are beginning to find that they're starting to have a prevalence of disease that's very similar to what we see in Western societies. But other than, of course, when they're still isolated and they have their own traditional diets and they still have their own lives and they move so much more and they have so much more activity and they have less exposure to toxins and chemicals and all of those things, they may also be still dying from infections and traumas at a much higher rate than the kind of westernized counterparts. But that's because of the way in which they live and the way in which they have or don't have access to some of our modern conveniences and or toxins.
Hmm. Hmm. You mentioned also our modern lifestyle is becoming much more sedentary. Isn't it true that like movement is actually an essential part of the function of the body to stimulate the metabolism and move like lymphatic fluid and just get things moving? Is that true?
100%. I mean, movement, it's interesting because I'm doing there's a project that I'm involved in with a Brazilian doctor actually. And we talk about exactly these components. It's about looking at metabolic health and how is that how is that being worsened by our kind of daily activities and our daily choices in this context of modern life, right? And interesting, there's a few very interesting papers. I'm happy to send you some links that you can
Please.
add to the show notes if you like.
Yeah.
But there's a couple of really interesting papers talking about what happens with sedentarism, and sedentarism being a new field of science, actually, because what researchers found is that there is physical activity has to be studied in a very different way, because physical activity will impact the body in a very different way to how sedentary behavior and sedentarism impacts disease. And so it began the way in which we live our lives these days began an entire field of science looking at what are the metabolic adaptations and what are the ways in which the body actually becomes diseased from lack of movement or
Mm.
from sedentary behavior of sitting and lying down, throughout the day. there are so many different amazing researchers, that I've been following in the last few years, Inigo San Milan being one of them, who basically researches this whole concept, and also Luc Van Loon, two researchers who really look very, very deeply into this whole mitochondrial impact of activity and or non-activity, both of which actually research elite athletes to look and understand the metabolic adaptations and changes that happens in normal people, especially when they become diseased from a metabolic perspective because of behaviors, sedentary behaviors being one of them. But one of the papers that I found really interesting recently talks about what it's like to be sedentary. And is it like this shocked me actually, because I'm somebody who trains, I love weights training. I have, kind of been very heavy into weightlifting for several years now. And like proper training.
Mhm.
So, and I go to the gym pretty regularly. It wouldn't be uncommon for me when I'm fully on to be like 6 days a week doing something, 7 day
Nice.
of an active recovery. So it's pretty reasonable. And and one day I'm reading this paper and I'm going, are you an active couch potato? I'm like, of course not. Like, no. So as I'm reading, it goes, if you go to the gym and you exercise 1 to 2 hours a day, but you sit for more than 6 hours in your day, which my aura ring was telling me that I was sitting for somewhat like 9 hours in a day. Hence why
Mm.
right now, even in doing this interview, I'm actually standing on my standing desk and moving
Nice.
around, right? Because when I read this paper, I was like, oh my God, like I'm an active couch potato, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Realized that if I continued like this, typically what happens is that as we age and as we get older, we are going to have natural entropy, which is a system that is organized, falling into chaos. And entropy is default. Right, it's gonna happen. It's just how quickly that happens for an individual is essentially the only question that we can insert into the conversation. And the opposite of entropy being syntropy, which is that organization of the system, is something that has to be worked on. It does not happen by default. It does not happen as a matter of course. And unless we focus on it, and this applies to infertility, to miscarriage, to metabolic health, every aspect of health is going to be impacted by entropy and syntropy. Entropy is just going to happen, right? That kind of descent into chaos of the system, of the organism, is a matter of when. It's a matter of speed and it's a matter of when. And so we have to figure out, okay, what are the things that I can input into this system that are going to actually reverse any kind of entropy that is reversible into syntropy, and how else are we going to be able to intervene in such a way that either improves the system or slows down the chaos of the system,
Mhm.
right? And really sedentarism is one of those things, because sedentarism will be at the core of impacting metabolic health, which is the core for overall health. Fertility and miscarriage are not exempt.
Got you. Got you. Um, the active couch potato. I never thought about that. Um,
Oh man, when I read that, I was like, oh,
you're
it's
like,
a
oh
sad day.
no.
Yes,
So
and so I started doing more cardio
I
in
heard
addition to.
I heard, I'm not a scientist or a doctor myself, but I heard that human beings are something like 70% water. Um, and so speaking of movement versus being sedentary, I like to think in kind of like metaphors, and it's like if we're 70% water, and what happens to water if you block the stream and make it stagnant? It gets really gross and stinky and nasty. So you have to keep that flowing. You have to keep the water, we're 70% water. We need to keep flowing. Otherwise, the water gets really gross and nasty.
That is such a great metaphor. I think actually is really, it's a great metaphor for exactly what the body needs. right, in order to be in optimum health. And of course, you have to keep that water stream as clean as possible. So, how do you do that? You do that by the things that you put into it. If you're going to put nasty things into the water, of course, it's going to become toxic. No matter how much you hope for and wish that is not true and is not the case, it's going to become toxic. And the reverse to that is also true. If you want to improve it, what do you have to do? You can't just leave it. It's not just going to filter itself, right? You have to put it through a process of filtration to come out of that, on the other end of that, with water that is potable, that is drinkable, that is healthy
Yeah.
once more, right? And so, absolutely, I think that's a really great way of really, it's a fantastic metaphor.
Thank you. Um, you mentioned also epigenetics, and I think it's Dr. Bruce Lipton who talks about epigenetics quite a bit. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that a little bit for the listeners and also tell me if I'm on the right track with it, in that it's not necessarily our DNA and genetics that will determine our health outcomes so much as it's the environmental inputs that we put into our system, into our that the inputs that we give to our genetics that will determine the result. So it's less about the actual genetics and more about the environment and the input that you give to the genetics. Is that am I on the right track with that?
Yeah, yeah, I think that that's, there's a saying in genetics that talks about, it's kind of a bit violent, but it talks about the fact that, the genes might load the gun, but it's the environment that pulls the trigger, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is that we all are born with genetic determinant factors, which is the genes we have. Okay. But the genes we have, they can be switched on or off depending on how we are operating in our lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what has the power to switch genes on and off? Well, everything from thought to toxin to different, things in our environment and day to day. Many different things have that power of switching the genes on or off. So the example that I gave in the very beginning, as we were discussing the impact of smoking, for example, cigarettes in the genes, for some person, it might switch on the gene of, let's generate cancer. For another person, it might switch on the gene of, you know what, atherosclerosis here is going to be a better answer, right? And so basically, it's really looking at the fact that we have predispositions. We all have predispositions. It's whether those predispositions will be realized in the time frame of our natural life that will come to play. It's said that, every man in their lifetime will develop prostate cancer, right? But that prostate cancer might happen at 90. That
Mm-hmm.
man might not live till 90. Okay. And so what happens is that it's deterministic in a way, but not really, because your what it is that you do in your day to day will then impact what happens. Same thing with Alzheimer's, for example. We probably all have, if we do things that are going to contribute to cells in the brain being damaged, mind you, metabolic health has a huge impact there too. There's lots of evidence these days showing the impact of metabolic disease on moods and mental health, metabolic disease and the development of Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's, in fact, being named type 3 diabetes, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you think about it from a fertility perspective, let's say that you have polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is a metabolic disease that causes insulin resistance and the body not working in the way that it needs to. And the first symptom of that will be irregular cycles. Well, if you don't treat that, what is going to happen is that you're much more likely to develop insulin resistance as a full blown condition, which may lead to metabolic syndrome, metabolic disease, which may lead to prediabetes, diabetes. Diabetes can then go into Alzheimer's, type 3 diabetes. So imagine, and this is what we were talking about before in terms of these conditions that are kind of like signaling conditions when it comes to infertility. most doctors will not even pay 2 cents of attention to a PCOS diagnosis in an 18-year-old. Literally, this happened to me. I was 18. I went to my doctor because I was like, well, I have lost my periods. It has been 6 months and I still haven't found them. And I wasn't pregnant. And, I went to this gynecologist and he did some tests and said, call me in 2 days and I'll give you the results. Okay, I called in 2 days. And he basically turns around on the phone and says to me, yes, you have polycystic ovarian disease. I froze. I was like, disease. I don't even know what the first thing is because, 18, I hadn't trained. I was just really knew nothing. And he says that, and I literally, I had to ask. I said, What does that mean? Like, am I going to die?" And he goes, "Oh no, you're probably just never going to have children." But other
Oh,
than that, yeah, exactly, Jeff. That's how I felt. I was like, "Really?" And you tell me that like that over the phone? Wow,
yeah, it's very
amazing.
sad.
It was kind of shocking. It was so shocking that I actually went, you know what? Like, my God, what is my life going to be like if that is true, you know? But
I
anyway,
would have said I'm getting a second opinion.
exactly. So I did more than that. I actually decided to go and train and specialize and, figure out how to overcome it. But
Yeah.
that was a whole trajectory that, happened as a result of that. But the reason that that was interesting is that because that was something that was going on, it made me, and I was aware, and then I was educated, and then I had experience, clinical experience and personal experience. I decided to go, okay, well, how do I address that? Because also I know that that being the case and my family history of diabetes, every single one of my grandparents had diabetes.
Mm.
So, and I know that this is just, a preview of what's to come if I don't address it. Hence why I went to have my 2-hour GTT as a kind of follow up every few years, and it was amazing. Result was stellar. Why? Because of how I actually live my day to day, the exercise, maintaining my health, all of that makes a huge, huge difference. But if that wasn't the case, the most likely scenario with the tendencies that I have is to be obese, is to have diabetes, and to probably have some other correlated chronic diseases because there's cardiovascular disease and diabetes in my family and cancer.
Wow.
Right. So if I'm not looking at how do I prevent, how do I optimize for the long term, I am looking at disease in the long term.
Yeah.
You
Can
see?
you can you share a little bit like do people know what causes PCOS and for the I'm sure you have probably many clients that come to you with this challenge. Can you share like what is the cause of that and also what are some like integrative approaches that you recommend for managing the
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So the cause of PCOS is like the cause of every other disease. You have these kind of like almost predispositions that get triggered by things that you do. In my case, it got triggered by being on the oral contraceptive pill. I had gone on the oral contraceptive pill for a year. I went off it, and it's something that's pretty documented in the literature. It's something that happens commonly,
is
and
birth control?
so birth control,
Yeah.
exactly. So basically, after coming off it, because I felt like, you know what, I think that I want to use more natural ways of managing my cycles. And when I came off it to do exactly that, then my cycles disappeared altogether. So it was very disturbing because I was like, hang on a second, like how and why? And that was something that I really wanted to get to the bottom of. So for different people, it happens for different reasons. And, of course, when it comes to these predispositions, there's this switching on of genes, switching on and off of genes. Clearly, in my kind of family history and in my genetics, I have this predisposition to metabolic disease, right? And PCOS being a representation of that, my family history of diabetes and other kind of metabolically related cancers also being a way of looking at that. So it's almost like, okay, genetics and genetic factors will play a role there, but I also need to make sure that I'm doing the parts that I can to switch off those genes, you see,
Mm.
because then it's about, okay, how can I? And look, there are so many studies. There's study after study these days, which is wonderful to see about the interventions that are effective for addressing these different types of metabolic diseases, metabolic conditions. Resistance training and aerobic training both being like incredible in this regard. And I'm talking like comparable to medicines, to medications,
I
right?
would
So there was a
probably
study
better.
that I yeah, well, it is better because it addresses and improves so many other aspects of one's
Yeah.
health and one's life. But in terms of like brute numbers and comparison of those in terms of like medication compared to exercise, exercise is either the same or better than medications, especially because also you don't have the side effects that you would with certain medications. So, it becomes a better overall strategy that also costs you nothing, and so that's the other than effort. um so it's about really looking at those things, and sometimes, like, it's almost the cause of something. And I say the same thing with infertility, because what happens is, yes, as much as it is important for us to get to the bottom of what are the biochemical chain reactions that are kind of breaking down to deliver this outcome, because whether it's inability to conceive, inability to keep a pregnancy to term, or whatever else is going on that's creating what we see, there are many biochemical chain reactions that are preceding what it is that we see. Yeah. And
Mhm.
so, in order for us to be able to change what we see, we have to actually almost go to those biochemical chain reactions and figure out, okay, what are the signals? What is breaking down? And on top of that, and I would say that, that would be my preferential way of addressing it, is start doing the things that you know are going to be beneficial, and then start to fine tune and analyze what else could be getting in the way, right? Because there is so much that a healthy diet and good quality exercise consistently is going to pardon in
Mm.
our day-to-day, kind of behaviors. So from that perspective, I think that there's a lot to be said for putting the basics in place, whether we're dealing with infertility, whether we're dealing with miscarriage, whether we're dealing with metabolic health, whatever it is, so that we can then figure out, okay, now that we've got to a base level, a foundational level of good health and a foundational optimal lifestyle, how do we then overlay upon it effective interventions or effective treatment to get us from where we now are to where we need to be, which might be a much smaller kind of piece of trajectory to go through than where we first started, you know? So
Mhm.
it's really about looking at it from that perspective as well, and figuring out how we can best support our bodies. Because I truly believe, one of the things that my original training, I'm trained as a naturopathic doctor. And, one of the premises of naturopathic medicine is looking at allowing the body to do what the body's wisdom already knows what to do or
Mm.
knows to do, right?
Mhm.
Which is essentially often when you remove the obstacles to optimum health, the body already know. You don't have to instruct it on how it is that it needs to put whatever in what place. You remove the obstacles and it just flourishes. It just does it. So I think that there's a lot to be said for that, and that inner wisdom that if you are supporting your body in the best possible way, it's going to deliver a different result already.
That's beautiful. Yeah, it's like if you support your system and your instrument, it's really a brilliant thing. If you just give
Yeah.
it the support, it's going to be really healthy and beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I'm
It's
curious.
sorry, but just to kind of,
Yeah,
punctuate that one thing, is
yeah.
like remove the obstacles, remove the things that, you know, here's essentially how I would put it to my patients who are trying to get pregnant. Because often people say to me, what is it that I need to do to have the best possible chance of getting pregnant? And I say, act pregnant now to get pregnant later. And it's this: every single thing that you absolutely would start doing or would stop doing if you were pregnant right now. And this applies to the men too, because men kind of like, and as much as you might have a little bit more difficulty in conceptualizing what it would feel like to be pregnant, you can kind of like put yourself into that mindset of like, okay, if I was gestating my baby, what would that look like? What would that feel like? What are the things that I would absolutely want to start doing? What are the things that I would absolutely stop doing? And even with your own partner, you would be able to articulate many things that you would recommend or you would like to see her start or stop doing. Which brings me to this very important point. Right now, within you and within every other person listening to this, you already have 50% of that little baby that you want to create right now, right? So, with that being the case, then you've got to ask yourself, okay, so what are the things that if I want to be as fertile as possible in the long term, that I need to sustain, maintain, and continue or begin to do or stop doing that's going to enable me to be as healthy and as fertile as possible for the long haul?
Yeah, that's super smart. I'm glad you said that because I bet a lot it's a little bit obvious once you say it, but I bet a lot of people don't think about start doing those things now. Start getting healthy and making better choices now before you get pregnant, and then it's going to increase your chances of having a
A
success.
100%, 100%. Because you see, also, this is the other thing that a lot of people don't realize. It take like the egg that a woman ovulates today has been in the process of maturation for 12 months before today. Right? And so what happens is that we women, we're born with all the eggs we'll ever have. There are two major processes, major stages of maturation, from primordial follicle to primary follicle, follicles that we were born with, to kind of like follicles that start to be picked up for maturation. That's the first process. That's the first stage. It takes around 6 months, right? The second stage, which is from primary follicle to ovulatory follicle, takes another 4 to 6 months.
Mm.
And so what happens is that in order for you to, yes, there is a lot of improvement you can make in the 4 to 6 month period to that maturation follicle, to that ovulatory follicle, and even 1 to 2 to 3 months preceding it. But if you really truly want to optimize the quality of the eggs, you do have to give it time. Same thing for men. Men are born with not the sperm that they will have, because sperm is produced all the time, but the cells that produce sperm, they can become damaged over time. They can become damaged over a lifetime by lifestyle factors, by smoking, by drinking, by lots of different things. And that, of course, decreases the ability to produce quality sperm. So, us enabling the body to have optimum health as much as possible helps to improve the quality of whatever cells we're talking about, whether it's egg or sperm, throughout a lifetime. Throughout our lifetime. And if we even consider the fact that fertility happens and begins in the lifetime before ours, that's also super important, because if you think about this, you, yes, were gestated in your mother's womb, but you were already in your grandmother's womb when your mother was an embryo and a fetus.
Wow.
So imagine, right? And hence why these days we have more understanding about the fact that, yes, our grandparents' lifestyles and behaviors imprint in our genes, and they will be manifested depending on the choices that we make in our lifetime. So, those are things that are important for us to consider, not just from the perspective that, sure, we can't change what has happened in our past, but we can certainly change what happens in our future, in our children's future, in our children's children's future by the
Hmm.
choices that we make today.
That's such a wild thought that I never thought about, but it's so true that I was also in my grandma's womb.
I know
That
it's
is
kind
like
of freaky.
wild to think about.
I know, but it's so true, right? And so, and every single one of us has had that same experience. If you're here because you had a grandmother, you know?
Hmm. Hmm. I've talked about a study on the podcast before, but this is making me think about it. The rose blossom study. I think it might have been done at Harvard. Basically, what they did was they took rats and then they emitted a scent of rose blossom and then they electrocuted them. And then every time they would smell the rose blossom, they would cower in fear. And then they bred them for 7 generations, and 7 generations down the line they would emit the rose blossom, and even without the electrocution, many generations down the line would still cower from the smell.
Yeah, yeah, genetic imprinting. And that is
Wild.
true, and that's true, and that even happens to humans, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so, that's, I think, one of the really important things for us to take into account is that often, even though you and I often hear, and I've heard, as you can imagine, I've been doing this work now for 24 years, so I hear it a lot when people tell me things like, but my neighbor, my sister, my uncle, my this, they drink, they smoke, they do drugs, and nothing happens, or they have healthy babies. And I kind of think, well, do they? You
Mm.
know, do they? Because that kind of exposure will cause some kind of genetic imprinting that we will have to deal with at some point down the track. And it's not even, even if that's quote unquote true, what we also need to think is that, well, it's not happening for you. Therefore, what are the things that you need to do differently if you're experiencing infertility, if you're experiencing miscarriages, if you're experiencing failed reproductive treatments, right? Those are the questions that I think is so important for people to have on their minds rather than accepting that, oh, everything is normal, just keep trying, or, oh, it's a numbers game, just keep trying. I'm like thinking, my God, when you have a sperm and an egg together and you have an embryo and that embryo gets transferred, let me tell you, you're pregnant. If you haven't seen a positive pregnancy test, it is because there are things that are not going the way that they need to be going. There are factors that are getting in the way. And so just trying to ignore that because it's more convenient to hear, just keep trying, it's a numbers game. I don't think it's the smartest decision. I don't think it's the best decision for your health now and for the long term and for future generations.
I imagine that it would be very mentally unhealthy too, because you're like, hey, I'm trying this thing, it's not working. I go to the doctor, and now the doctor's not helping me. Now you're just like in the stress loop.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a huge challenge and it's real. And unfortunately, like I said, it would be nice if there was better support, from healthcare systems. It's not even that doctors don't try their best, but I think that there's also a lot of um, I don't know. There's a lot of conflicts of interest in this process because if you think about it, IVF, there's a fantastic reason for it to exist, and it does benefit many couples. But
mhm.
I think that it should never be a first line of intervention. It should never be a first line of treatment because if you don't understand why you need it to begin with, there are so many questions you need to ask. And obviously, for many of those, we've already talked about why. There's so many questions you need to ask to be able to actually get a better result and a better outcome in terms of reproductive health and reproductive outcome,
Yeah.
i.e., baby in your arms, right? Other than just continuing to go through these failed and failed cycles. And, like 70% of IVF cycles fail. 70% of
Oh wow.
IVF cycles fail. With the fact that, IVF is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So I question in my mind as well, I wonder if that has to do with the fact that there are profits to be made and that it's much easier for us to just continuing accepting the status quo than to really stop, take a step back, pause, revisit, and understand, okay, what is happening here and how do we need to address this in a different way to really optimize the entire system and the entire process as well as the outcomes that we get through treatment. And I think there's a lot to be said for, people taking responsibility for understanding what it really means to be experiencing the challenge of infertility. And it's so hard because the thing that most couples at a most vulnerable time in their life and their existence are being told, oh yeah, no, don't worry about it. We can bypass all of these things with IVF. But I think that we have to at some point also have critical thinking, right?
Hmm.
And really be able to say, okay, am I implementing all of the things that I possibly could? Am I understanding the reasons why this is not working? Because if you don't understand, it's either a matter that you need to ask more questions, deeper questions, or question somebody else. Because clearly, continuing down a path that's consistently failing and expecting a different result is, in fact, madness. And that's where it becomes a really very difficult mental health bombing exercise, right? Because you're just really trying and it's just not working, and you continue trying and it continues not to work, and you're worsening your health along the way. So it's a lose-lose situation. I think that there's a really big demand for thinking about the situation differently and acting accordingly.
A lot of my peers, I would say, for whatever reason, are having children a little bit later in life. Um, at what point would you say like age really becomes a factor? Like, is there a certain number where you're like, okay, you're pushing it?
It's hard to say that number because
Mm-hmm.
here's the thing. Women will naturally end their ability to reproduce at menopause. So at that point, all the eggs are used up. There is absolutely no more to go around, and that's just how it is. And then we know that, okay, if we are then from that point onwards wanting to reproduce and wanting to have a baby, we're going to have, and these days we can, have donor egg or donor embryo and make that happen. However, what happens is that, let's say, natural age of menopause for most women across the average range is 50. So if you are going to be menopausal at 50, what also is going to happen is that you're going to be perimenopausal, have those fluctuations in hormones and kind of like on and off fertility for 5 to 10 years before 50.
Mm-hmm.
So let's look back at what that looks like. If it happens at 50, at 45, 40 to 45, we are having or beginning to have some of those fluctuations, right? If a woman becomes menopausal at 45, at 35 to 40 is where those fluctuations begin to occur. Hence why you hear so much women being given this message that if they're 35, they're getting old, they're running out of time, and they should really rush to IVF because that's the only option they have. Untrue, untrue. It's a perpetuated myth. However, it's one that sells very
Mm-hmm.
well because it really does attach itself to that fear of, oh my God, what happens if this never happens? What happens if I do indeed run out of time? And am I going to be childless? And what does that look like? And oh no, that's not what I want. And so there's a whole lot of fear that starts to be injected into this conversation that really
Mm-hmm.
doesn't belong there,
Yeah.
and men, and I think, and I hope, Jeff, that for you now it's going to be very different because most men will have a very blasé attitude when things aren't going quite right
Mm-hmm.
for the couple, right? Men will typically be like, oh, it's going to happen. It's going to happen when it happens. It's great attitude to have because it supports your partner in not being completely stressed out about the fact that they really need to hurry things along as a couple, right? Because fertility is a team sport. It's a 50-50 equation. 50% of the reason why a miscarriage happens is because of male factor, 50% because of female factor. And of course, it's kind of like 40-40 and 20% embryonic factor. But if you look at the things that you can actually intervene on, it's the male and female factor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So basically, given that that's the case, we do need to take into account that, okay, proactivity is going to be useful. Men going and being proactive about doing semen analysis and understanding their fertility from a holistic perspective, way before they actually want to have a baby, is going to also be very helpful. And understanding that, male fertility, just as well as women's fertility, does decline with health, with age, and health, because what happens is that, as I said before, some of those cells that produce sperm can start to become damaged over the years, right? Over time. Also, sexually transmitted infections can damage those cells and can create other different problems that, essentially are going to be important to take into consideration. So when somebody's like thinking, okay, well, maybe in 5 years I would like to start a family, I would recommend immediately going to have all of the tests that you would need to have to figure out, okay, what are things looking like right now? I had
Hmm.
one clinician that worked in my practice. She had literally just graduated from naturopathic school, and she was 21. And she was like, you know what? I think I really want to have children. I just want to make sure that everything is. Well. I said, look, I think that's always a good idea. Like I did those tests when I was very young, and I said to her, I said, you should go and do, this is the list of tests, go and do them. And, just so that you know where you're at. She had premature ovarian failure. She had to literally like make a decision to what she was going to do next for her reproductive life. And she ended up deciding to actually start trying to have a baby because she knew that she really wanted to do that. So had she left it for 5 to 10 years, she would have gotten to the other side of those 5 and 10 years and realized that she was now infertile and unable to have children
Hmm. Hmm.
altogether. And you don't think of that when you're 21. I certainly didn't think of that when I was 18 before that phone call, right?
Yeah.
And so the thing about it is that the more proactive you can be, the more you have choices that you can make rather than have choices made for you
Um,
when it comes to reproductive health.
I appreciate also that you mentioned that it's a team sport. Lots of times this conversation gets like kind of unfairly dumped onto women, and I
Yeah.
think I'm glad that you mentioned that it's a 50-50 team sport in this endeavor. Um, I we talked about toxins also and environmental factors. There's one change that I've made in my life recently. It was not directly related to trying to have a baby. Like I said, I'm single right now. Maybe I'll have a family one day. I would like to, but um, I'm curious what your thoughts are. I recently, this is going to sound a little weird, but I'm just going to say it. I'm changing my briefs, like my boxers, to
Ah,
I'm trying to wear like all like merino wool and like really good materials. Like, sometimes you get like the athletic ones and they're made out of like straight up plastic. Like, and I'm like, I don't want to be wearing plastic like on my parts over here. So I'm trying to wear
okay, so
like
a couple of things for the ladies, the single ladies out there listening to this podcast. This is a catch right here, everybody. So, you know, this is definitely a catch. Like, just putting it out there to the ladies.
thank
But
you.
here's the thing. Yeah. No, but here's actually, all jokes aside, and that is also true because being proactive is a
Blushing.
sign of maturity and a sign of, like, yes, this is a really good thing. But the thing about it is what you're doing is actually really smart from the perspective that there's two reasons. The more natural the materials that you use in your body, the less you are going to end up with toxins being on your body that are going to be, and we didn't talk about this, but this is exactly what you're talking about, is exactly what I would look at for my patients. There are two reasons to wear boxer shorts that are loose and made of natural fibers. Okay. And natural fibers being cotton, merino wool is fine. As long as it's comfortable, that's great, and loose. Because what happens is that if your testicles are too close to your body, they are going to be heated to a much higher temperature than what is ideal for sperm to form properly. So, sperm motility, as I was describing the lineup, earlier on as we were discussing, will definitely negatively be impacted by testicles that are too hot or too close to the body. So that's why testicles actually live outside of the body. That's why they descend in the way that they do and they stay outside of the body, other than when it's really, really cold. And obviously, then they go up closer to the body. But typically, they do need to be a couple of degrees cooler than the rest of your body. Okay, so boxes that are more loose are definitely going to help with that. The other thing, remember how we were talking about the toxins and the exposures? And I didn't mention this word, but essentially, this is what they are: endocrine disruptors. Anything in our day to day, whether they are particularly plastics, and I've been part of a group at Harvard that studies exactly these forever chemicals and plastics, bisphenols, phthalates, all of that. What we found and what we find and what's found typically in the literature is exactly the effect of hormonal imbalancing effect that these endocrine disruptors or toxins, and they can be in the form of many different things, from boxer shorts, clothes that we wear, to cleaning products in the home, to pots, pans, containers of food, like non-stick pans. Oh my God, those things are horrific. I would never buy any. All of those types of chemicals have this hormonal imbalancing impact, or this endocrine disruptive impact that we want to avoid. And what you've described with these materials that are kind of plastic, they are so close to your body, they are being absorbed into your body, into your bloodstream, and creating some kind of endocrine disruption because they are being absorbed just by being there. Right. So again, that's actually a really good strategy, is figuring out what are the things that you are wearing, what are the things that are in your day to day, what are the creams, potions, lotions, perfumes, aftershaves, like all of those things. They're best avoided, they're best minimized, they're best, kind of used very sporadically, if at all, unless they are extremely made out of extremely natural things,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a good strategy, and certainly a very important point.
Yeah, I've got some friends even who use like this deodorant that's like a crystal. You like put water on it
Yeah,
and then like put it
yeah.
on. It's like very, very
Now,
natural.
but those particular ones, you got to look on the label to make sure that it doesn't say aluminium, or in,
Uh
as say in America, aluminum.
Aluminum.
Um, yeah, that's it. There you go. You say it better than me. So aluminium is definitely going to be a heavy metal that we want to avoid. There are definitely lots of like much more natural. Certainly, those antiperspirants are going to be terrible. You can be
Yeah.
sure, like, your kind of things that you buy in the supermarket is probably not going to be the best option. But definitely wear deodorant. Do that. That's very important. Very good for social norms and the happiness
Yeah.
of the population.
Yeah.
But do seek things that are much more natural. I do have one that is my absolute favorite. I don't know if you can even buy it here, and there's no conflict of interest. It's called black chicken, and it's a paste. And there are two different options. One is a sensitive skin one that doesn't have bicarbonate soda, because that can sometimes, really kind of create eczema and, like skin irritation. So that's my go-to. I love it. I use it. They don't pay me to say this. I just really love that deodorant.
Nice. Nice. Um, well, I'm feeling great about this conversation. I feel like very after a conversation like this, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to the gym after this, and then I'm gonna go buy some organic chicken and feeling like
That's good. That's how it should be. And one last thing, if I can, like, if we can finish up on people actually, what are the action steps that they take away from this,
please, yeah,
other than, the act pregnant now to get pregnant later. One thing that, if I was to recommend absolutely nothing else, is a really good quality water filter in your sink that gets installed. Either a reverse osmosis is probably going to be the best, with a remineralization capsule that puts the nutrients back in. Because what happens is that these days, the amount of toxins, there was a study that I came across once that, I broke my heart, 973 chemicals or something found in a sample of water in a kind of city in the United States. And there was everything in there, from Prozac to the oral contraceptive pill, birth control, to, cocaine, to God knows what else, right?
whoa,
Yes. So the thing about that is that those toxins, we ideally, as you mentioned, we are 70% water. And so what happens is that in order to stay hydrated, for the body to operate well and function well, we need approximately 2 liters of water a day, whatever that is in American measurements. I'll
two
let you
liters,
calculate that.
yeah,
2 liters is what?
it's like one of those big soda bottles.
Yeah, but we don't want to be drinking it in soda. We want to definitely make
Yeah,
sure that
and
it's
and don't
sparkling.
drink it and don't drink it out of the plastic if you can avoid that too.
No, exactly. 100%. 100%. So 2 liters in ounces is 67 ounces. There you go.
Okay,
Um, 67, 68 ounces. But the key thing here is that yes, absolutely avoid plastics, avoid plastic water bottles. And this is why I say make sure that you're drinking, like that you have a water filter installed in your kitchen sink. Like no matter where I move around the world, I have a plumber come in, install my water filter. That
Beautiful.
is my absolute rule of life, right?
Mhm.
Because I know how important that is. If there's nothing else I do, like even if sometimes I can't actually get an organic something, I will follow the EWG list of the 30,000 and the clean 15 and reduce my pesticide intake. But I will not drink water that's unfiltered. So that's something that is super important and that people do need to investigate this part further is like getting a really good quality water filter. On Amazon these days, gosh, you can buy a reverse osmosis really good water filter for like $300.
Yeah.
Right. So it's something that's viable for most people and as much as possible, like even in condominiums, in apartment blocks and whatever, if you have these water filters that you can go to the gym and get, your big bottle of water, just take that with you if you don't have a water filter at home. The one thing that I will say about having a water filter at home that you want to make sure that you're cooking your foods with filtered water as well, right? As much as
Again.
possible
Mhm.
because then you're reducing the amount of toxins that you're intaking in your body from these external sources by making sure that you avoid those pollutants.
Have you ever seen one of those alkaline filters? Like one of my friends has a Kangen.
Yes, but you see, the thing about a reverse osmosis and even a carbon filter is that the micron filtration, the fine aspect of the filtration of those filters is zero point 0.1 microns. So zero point 0.1 microns is the maximum that I would want to see in my own water filter. One of those water filters usually has about a 1 micron, a 1 to 5 microns. So it's much, much thicker. It allows particles that are much bigger to get into the water.
Mhm.
And for filtration of fine heavy metals and endocrine disruptors, which usually are very, very, very fine, you need this kind of much, much more um, refined filtration element.
Yeah, I'm glad you shared that. I try to always drink filtered water in my life, and I try my hardest to also avoid drinking it from plastic bottles, plastic
Yes.
cups, single-use bottles. Quick story. I know we're getting close to the end here. When I first moved to LA, which was many years ago, and I had some roommates and I filled up a glass of tap water and I was about to drink the tap water and they were like diving across the table like, "No, don't drink the tap water." But yeah, I've
I'll
come a
behave.
long way, and yeah, I agree. I'm glad you mentioned like get a really good water filter, and if you do the RO, if you do the reverse osmosis, you got to add the minerals back in.
Yes, yes, very important, very important. But yeah, I mean, there's a kind of like some life hacks that will really benefit you, not just for fertility, hormonal balance, and long-term fertility, potential, but also life in general. Like that. This is quality, long-term quality of life 101, and increased health span
Mhm.
101.
Mhm. I love it. I thank you so much for coming on and sharing all these things. Um, for people who want to find more or maybe want to get in touch with you and maybe work with you, how can they find you?
Sure. They can Google me. So Gabriela, Gabriela Rosa, Gabriela Rosa. And also my website is fertilitybreakthrough.com. And for those who might be struggling with infertility or miscarriage or failed treatments, my book called Fertility Breakthrough, Overcoming Infertility and Recurrent Miscarriage When Other Treatments Have Failed, is free on YouTube. It's free on Spotify and it's available on Amazon everywhere in the world, so people can get that and just have a listen or have a read. But I think that one of the biggest things that people need to remember is that your body is incredible and it's magical in so many ways. And when you give it the opportunity to recover and regenerate and heal, it's incredible what it has the power to do. And I really want to leave people with that reminder. I think that's such an important thing.
I agree. Thank you so much for coming on, and I think we'll leave it there.